In this lecture, we will be looking at Chapter 3, Egypt from Narmer to Cleopatra. To begin with, we start with Egypt and Egyptology. Now, last chapter, I told you, remember, place yourself geographically. Well, what's interesting for this chapter, for the most part, we're going to be relatively in the same geographical location, and then we're going to look at how the artwork changed chronologically, meaning over time. So with Egypt, you can see in the map here on the left, the backbone of Egypt was the Nile River. The river is the longest river in the world, and every year it flooded. It was, you could depend on it would flood. And what would happen is after the floodwaters receded is it would leave behind this fertile soil. Because of this, the land was very nutrient rich. You would have food there for your livestock, and then you could also cultivate and have farmers there. And also the Nile was the people depended on because it actually ran through some areas that may not have gotten any rain in years. And the fertility of Egypt became very famous. Now, during the Middle Ages, much of the history of Egypt was lost or forgotten, and it wasn't until the 18th century Enlightenment in Europe that brought back a desire to learn more. And so basically what has happened is we've been able to piece together some history from different sources, including biblical sources, the Greek historian Herodotus, and we do have a preserved history from a 3rd century BCE. It's a history of Egypt written by the Greek Manetho, and he was actually an Egyptian high priest. Now, Manetho describes the succession of Egyptian rulers, and he calls them dynasties, a term we still use. However, it's been discovered his chronology is actually not accurate. And to this day, many historians do not agree on the actual dates of many of the different rulers in Egypt. It actually is not until after 664 BCE that we can be certain of the dates. So that's why if you see in here some of the dates seem to overlap or, kind of duplicate, that's why, because we can't be 100% sure. And then Egyptology, the modern study, Egyptology meaning the study of Egypt, this emerged in the late 18th century with archaeological exploration of the land. In fact, Napoleon Bonaparte took a large team of scholars with him to explore and learn about Egypt, and they published a work called Descriptions of Egypt in 1804. And this was a groundbreaking work based on the data they discovered and learned here. And then also another very important find is what's called the Rosetta Stone, and that's an image of it on the right. The Rosetta Stone is actually now located in the British Museum, but this was key to understanding Egyptian writing and hieroglyphics. So what you have on the stone, you can see here, it's broken into 3 sections. And on it, there is 3 inscriptions. One is in Greek, one is in a form of late Egyptian writing, and one is in hieroglyphics. And the belief is that this basically is supposed to be a translating tool, and that all 3 inscriptions are the same. So using this, people knew and understood the Greek, and so they used that Greek to then translate both the Egyptian writing and the hieroglyphics. And because of this ability to read the hieroglyphics, which is the pictorial language, if you will, being able to read these hieroglyphic inscriptions revolutionized the study of Egyptian civilization and art. All right, so now we are going to start with our journey through Egypt. We're going to start in what's called the pre-dynastic and early dynastic periods. And so what happens is the history of Egypt actually predates writing. And we don't know much from that time except for objects that are found. Often these would be found in the tombs, and they'd be pottery and other artifacts. And we've dated these artifacts as far back as 3500 BCE. Now we'll start with the pre-dynastic period, and we're going to look at painting and sculpture. Now, at this time, Egypt was divided geographically and politically into Upper Egypt, which I'll go back to the map here, into Upper Egypt, which is actually the southern part, and Lower Egypt, which is the northern part. So you can see those both on the map here. Most pre-dynastic art has actually been found in Upper Egypt. And an example of this is what you're seeing here. And this is the palette of King Narmer. This pre-dynastic period ended with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. We're not 100% sure when this happened. However, King Narmer is given credit for this. And this palette is one of these reasons, because this is a ceremonial palette, meaning it was created to commemorate in celebration of something. And this palette is a stone slab with a circular depression. You can see on the right image here that circular depression. And these were actually commonly used in Egypt, and it was used to store their eye makeup, the black coal eye makeup. This was worn by both men and women. And it was used to shade from the sun, right? Think of like baseball players when they put the black under their eyes, right? And so it was used to shade from the sun, and it was also used as a makeup to enhance appearance. This palette is one of the earliest existing historical artworks. Now, it's believed the scenes on the palette actually show this unification of the two kingdoms under Narmer. It's one of the earliest examples of the formula of figure representation that's going to become characteristic of Egyptian art for almost 3,000 years. Now, this is made of slate, and it's about 2 feet 1 inch in height. Both sides are topped with 2 heads of cows with a woman's face. This is believed either to be the divine mother of all Egyptian kings or the sky goddess Bat. The back, which is going to be the image on the left, this shows the king wearing the crown of Upper Egypt, and he is shown slaying a captured enemy. This signifies the inevitable triumph of the Egyptian godlike kings over their foes. And then it also shows a man-headed hieroglyph with papyrus plants growing from it. This signifies the king's victory over the land of Lower Egypt. Now, the other image, the image on the right, shows the front. Again, the circular depression, that's where the makeup would go. And now we see the king, he's now wearing the crown of Lower Egypt. He's looking, this is on that top right. What we see there is the dead bodies of the enemy are around him. And the figure of the king towers over both his men and the enemy. And in the bottom, in the lowest band, we see a great bull. And this symbolizes the king's superhuman strength. Because we have to remember, the kings at this time were looked like as almost gods. Now, this portrayal of Narmer combines, when we look at his form, it combines profile views of his head, legs, and arms, and frontal views, though, of his eye and torso. This would become the standard for Egyptian art. Also, how the palette is organized, especially on the front, with these bands. We see these horizontal bands, each one telling us a different part of the story. And again, this established this compositional scheme, which would be used, it would become the norm in Egypt for over a millennium. And now at this point, I do want to remind you to read the sidebars that are in your text at this point in the textbook. There is one on the gods and goddesses of Egypt, and a very interesting one about the mummification process and the ideas of immortality. And so moving on, we're going to look at architecture. Most of the information we actually have about ancient Egypt comes from what was found in tombs. And these tombs were constructed to ensure safety and happiness in the next life. Because what happens was there was the belief that in the afterlife. And what happens when you die is the Ka would actually still reside within the dead body. And so the body had to be preserved. And so there was a place for the dead person to experience the afterlife. And so the first of these are what are called mastabas. It's Arabic for bench. And this was a standard tomb type in early Egypt. Basically, it's rectangular brick or stone structure with sloping sides erected over an underground burial chamber. Originally, these housed single burials, but eventually they would become more complex to house other family members after they died. Again, they had the burial chamber within them, and then a chapel with a false door. So the Ka could join the world of the living and partake in meals that were placed on an offering table. Now, we're also going to see some that have what's called the serdab, and this was a small room for housing a statue of the deceased. And part of the reason why these were in there was so it was clear whose tomb this was. And so the idea of these tombs or so there was a place in the afterlife for the Ka. And you would want in this tomb anything else that you would want in the life, you would want it in your afterlife. And so that's why all these possessions, including food, clothing, utensils, all of that would be in these burial chambers. So it would be there for you in the afterlife. And so what we are looking at here, we are looking at the tomb of King Djoser. This was actually designed, King Djoser reigned from 2630 to 2611 BCE, and he was a king in the 3rd dynasty. Now, Imhotep was a master builder for the king. He also was his official seal bearer, and he was the high priest of the sun god Re. Now, what's interesting with him is he designed the tomb of Djoser. And so Imhotep is actually the first artist name ever recorded in the history of the world. And so he designed this step pyramid for Djoser's tomb. It's located at Saqqara of Memphis. And this is basically an ancient what's called necropolis, which is literally a city of the dead. This was built before 2600 BCE, and it is one of the oldest stone structures in Egypt, and it is actually the first of the stone pyramids. Now, each side faces one of the cardinal points on the compass, remember north, south, east, and west, and it's about 200 feet high. And so this was actually composed of a series of mastabas of diminishing size stacked one on top of another. Now remember, this is a tomb. It's not a temple like what we saw in the last chapter throughout Mesopotamia. This is a tomb. The function, again, was to protect the mummified king and to show his absolute godlike power. Now, underneath it, there's also a vast subterranean complex, almost like a palace. And again, this is where, they would live for the afterlife. The pyramid itself, you can see in the reconstructed drawing here, it was near the middle of a 37-acre space that was enclosed with a rectangular wall. The wall was made of white limestone. It's 34 feet high and over 5,400 feet long. And then what would happen is priests would actually perform daily rituals at the temple in celebration of the immortal ruler. Because remember, they saw them as godlike. And so once they died, once they went to the afterlife, many of them would then also be worshipped like gods. Also, what's interesting to note are the engaged columns. Engaged columns means they're attached to the wall behind them. And these are located on the north facade of the complex. And if you look at them, right, the shafts resemble papyrus stalks, and the capitals at the top actually take the shape of papyrus blossoms. Now, what's so interesting with these are obviously just decremental, right? They're not holding up the wall, they're not holding up any roof, but these are actually the earliest known stone columns in the history of architecture. All right, moving on to the Old Kingdom. This, when we think of Egypt, this image here is what most people think of. So this was actually the first of 3 great periods of Egyptian history. It ends around 2134 BCE. And so again, we're going to start with architecture. The Old Kingdom is going to start with the 4th dynasty. And here we have the 4th dynasty and the pyramids of Gizeh, probably the most well-known view of Egypt. The pyramids of Gizeh are actually the oldest of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And these were constructed, it's 3 major pyramids that were constructed over about 75 years. And it serves as tombs of 3 kings of the 4th dynasty. We have Kefi, who ruled 2551 to 2528, Khafra, who's 2520 to 2494, and Menkora, who's 2490 to 2472. I know I said that quickly, but those are all also in your textbooks. Now, this tomb shape you can see is different from the stepped pyramid of Djoser. Here we have the pyramid shape. And this change, it was believed to have happened due to the powerful cult of Re, and the emblem of Re's cult was the pyramid stone. And so that's why there was this belief of why the design changed. Also, the pyramid was a symbol of the sun, and there was the idea that the sun's rays were the ladder that the god kings used to ascend to the heavens. The four sides are oriented to, again, the cardinal points on the compass. However, the Gizeh temples, and this shows the influence of the sun again, the temples are on the east side facing the rising sun, again showing the importance of the sun. And now this is not just, as we've said, a single pyramid. This is 3 different tombs for 3 different rulers. And in fact, there is a whole funerary complex at Gizeh. This is represented in your textbook because I just realized I didn't put the key on here. But you can see the entire complex. So we have the pyramids, which were the god king's burial chambers. We have the mortuary temple near the front. This is where priests would make offerings to the deceased king. The roofed causeway, the long walkway, was actually covered. This would lead to the mortuary temple. And then we have what's called the valley temple. And then in front of the far right pyramid, you see smaller pyramids, and this would have been for family members. And then also probably one of the most well-known images of the pyramids is the Great Sphinx. The Great Sphinx was built circa 2520 to 2494 BCE, and it's located beside the causeway by the walkway. Now, it is carved from the spur of rock from the Gizeh quarry. It is made of sandstone. It is 65 feet high, and it's believed to be the image of the king Khafra. We aren't 100% sure of that, though. Now, he is depicted as a sphinx, which is a lion with a human head. And again, this was done intentionally because what it's doing, it's combining the human form with the fearsome strength and authority of the king of the beasts, right? So this godlike king combined with the king of the beast. Now, sculpture at this time also fulfilled an important function in Egyptian tombs. Because again, there was the belief that the Ka would survive in the mummified remains. However, if those remains would break down, the belief was that these sculptures could then be a substitute home for the Ka if the embodied corpse deteriorates. And so that's why we're going to see several of these works within these great tombs, because you needed a place for the Ka to go. Now, these works could be made with wood, clay, and other materials, but most were actually made of stone. The sculptures of the kings were often very rigid and flattering, right? They would be shown young. They would be shown in good physical form because, this is a godlike king. You can't show any, flaws. They are, again, not meant to be exact images, but they're meant to show this strength. And here's 2 examples. We have Khafre enthroned on the left and Menkora on the right standing. And it's believed Menkora is shown with one of his wives. You can see they are both very stiff and formal. Even the one that's sitting down. Look at the arms. It's like almost 90-degree angles. They are both frontal facing, and again, those stiff arms, and in fact, look at the hands. The hands are usually in fists. Many of these were actually attached to either a background or a base, so technically they're what are called high relief sculptures, meaning it's attached to some sort of background. Again, the artist's aim was not to portray vibrant living figures, but to suggest the timeless nature of the stone statue that might be needed to serve as an eternal substitute home for the Ka. Remember again, if the idea was If the body breaks down, then the ka can go into these statues. Now, some sculptures, not all were painted. This is an example of one on the left that was painted. It does make them more lifelike. And then also, not all works were just of the gods or of the kings. And so we can see here on the left, this is a sculpture of a scribe. So this is somebody who would be honored, but definitely not like a king or a god. And so here we see it's much more realistic. It's not idealized. Also in the tombs, we would often have relief sculptures that would decorate the walls. Now, these sculptures were a reflection of life of the person, but also it was supplies for the afterlife. Farming, hunting, and dieting all were seen as providing nourishment for the ka. And so the reliefs are actually full of anecdotal details, tells us, stories of the person's life. However, the Egyptian artist's primary goal was not storytelling, but to suggest the deceased's eternal existence in the afterlife was a reflection of his life on earth. And you should have read in the beginning of the reading, right, this idea of balancing, that your heart gets weighed along the feather, and that just depends or decides on if you go to the afterlife or not. Yeah. All right, well, next we're going to move to the Middle Kingdom. So by 2150 BCE, the weak rulers of the Sixth Dynasty, it led to about 100 years of civil unrest. In 2040 BCE, a king of Upper Egypt, Mentuhata, took control. He again united Egypt under a singular ruler, and he reigned from 2050 to 1998 BCE. And this establishes the Middle Kingdom, and this is from the 11th to the 14th dynasties. It lasted 400 years. Now, what's interesting in this time, most artists did follow the practices of the Old Kingdom, but there are some exceptions. And what we're seeing here on the left, this is an exception. And this is actually a portrait of Sensret the third. He ruled from 1878 to 1859 BCE. And what we see here, when you look at this image, it's the body, we don't see the body here, but the body was idealized, much like, the sculptures here. The body was idealized into this, young, physically fit form. However, look at the face, look at the head. This is much more realistic, and it's believed to be a much more realistic representation of the king's features. It shows him more as he was. We see that he's an older man with these protruding ears, round eyes with heavy lids. There's lines on his forehead showing age, and we even see the aging flesh, and then the downturned mouth. And so many believe that this is showing him as he actually was. Now, some historians think this may have been to show that he was actually a weak ruler, while others think it is to show him as old and wise, and with the youthful body still show he has the physical vigor to be this god king. Now, architecture at this time, we're going to see the tombs, the design of tombs being moved away from pyramids and the mastabas to what's called these rock-cut tombs. And they were exactly what they sound like. These are tombs that were cut out of rocks. Basically, they'd be hollowed out of the cliffs. You would see shallow column, or there would be a shallow porch, which you can see in the top right image here. And it would be, you'd have the columns. This would then lead inside to a hall that was lined with columns, and then into the burial chamber. So the bottom image, here you can see this is inside of one of these rock-cut tombs. Again, we would have statues of the deceased in these for the same reason. If the body did not survive, then there would be a place for the ka to go. And then the walls and the ceilings were painted and with murals and also relief sculptures. Now, what's interesting, you can tell this especially on this bottom image, the columns in the Middle Kingdom very closely resemble later Greek Doric columns. And this clearly shows the Greeks knew and were influenced by Egyptian arts, because these predate the Doric order in Greece. All right, next we're going to move to the New Kingdom. So the Middle Kingdom collapsed when the Hyksos attacked. They ruled the area until about the mid-16th century, when the kings of the 17th dynasty revolted. Ahmose the First reigned 1550 to 1525 BCE, and he is considered the first king of the 18th dynasty. Now, the New Kingdom is considered the most glorious period of Egypt's history. This is when the kings became known as pharaohs. If you've noticed, I haven't said pharaoh yet. We tend to think, all the rulers of Egypt are the pharaohs, especially when we look at the pyramids. They actually weren't known as pharaohs until the New Kingdom. Also, during this time period in the New Kingdom, the empire was greatly extended, or Egypt was greatly extended. And then the city of Thebes in Upper Egypt became a great city of a great metropolis with magnificent palaces, tombs, and temples. And again, we're going to see in our architecture these grand temples that were built, again, temples and tombs that were built. Some of them were built to worship the state gods, but most of them were actually mortuary temples where the pharaohs could worship during their lives, and then they would serve as the temples, the tombs, in their honor after their death. Many of these arose along the Nile in the area surrounding Thebes. And so what we're looking at here is the mortuary temple of Deir el-Buri. What's very interesting about this is that it was erected for and by a female pharaoh, and her name is Hatshepsut. Now, it's interesting how she came to power. Basically, she claimed her father, Thutmose I, had chosen her as her successor when he was still alive. And so basically, after Thutmose II died, he didn't have any living sons except by a minor wife, and so he was real young, and so Hatshepsut was actually put in charge of him, like he was his ward. Well, basically, she decided, no, I'm going to be the ruler. And so this is where, again, she claimed her father had actually chosen her as his successor. So she became the pharaoh, and she is actually the first great female monarch whose name has ever been recorded in history. And she ruled for over 2 decades. Now, what's interesting, and you can look at the example in the textbook, she's often portrayed as male. And she did this very importantly because she wanted to be known as king, not as queen. She was king. She was the pharaoh. And so often she would, dress in all of the traditional garb of the pharaoh. And she also claimed to have a divine birth, and that she was actually the daughter of the god Amun-Re. The temple you can see here, this was her mortuary temple. Again, a place where she would worship while she was alive, and then it would become a temple and a tomb for her after her death. Now, the temple rises from the valley floor in 3 columned-lined terraces that are all connected by ramps along the central axis. Now, what's interesting, you can see how large this structure is, and it actually was once part of an even larger complex. Now, within this, there were over 200 statues of her in the complex, including in the lowest terrace, she is repeatedly represented as a sphinx. And then in the uppermost level, there are at least 8 colossal statues of her in a kneeling position, and they are made of red granite. And these are all put in position lining the entrance to the Amun-Ra sanctuary. Another great temple, this is the temple of Ramses II, and this again is a rock-cut temple. Ramses II reigned from 2090 to 2024 BCE, and he ruled for over 2/3 of a century. Right, that's a long time, even nowadays, let alone back in these times when life expectancy was not that long. He is the last of the great warrior pharaohs. And again, this temple is dedicated to the worship of his divine essence. And design was done very particularly. It was designed so that at the summer and the winter solstice, the rising sun would actually illuminate the king's image inside. And so the sun would go, and you can see that door would shine in there, and you could see the king. Outside, this is a very famous facade. You see 4 colossal images of Ramses himself. It is facing south, and literally this was done, it's facing Egypt's southern neighbor, and it was done as a form of intimidation. Each of these, even those they are sitting, are still over 65 feet tall. And then inside, there's many sculptures of him and his most important family members. Now, what's interesting in the New Kingdom is that sculpture, this type of sculpture called block statues, became popular. And you see this in the image on the left. And basically, they became popular because their large, flat surfaces were well suited for lengthy inscription. So many things could be written on them. Also, the shapes were much easier to carve, and they were more durable, meaning there weren't pieces to break off. They show an even more simplification of the human form, but they still performed the same function, this home of the Ka, if it was needed. And then painting at this time, again, following a lot of the same examples from earlier. Many of the paintings that we have preserved, these are mural paintings in tombs. And some of the best preserved ones are in a tomb of, his name was Nebamon, and literally he was a wealthy man. And then these murals, they're what's called fresco secco, or dry fresco, which means they were painted on the wall after the plaster has already dried. And these allowed, with these frescoes, with doing the dry fresco, it made it so you could spend longer and be more detailed. Because when you do the wet type of fresco, literally you are painting in the plaster, and so you can only paint as long as the plaster is still wet. So these frescoes actually show him living the luxurious life of the Egyptian nobility. They're filled with good food and drink, fine musicians, dancers, leisure time to hunt and fish. But just like the early works, these aren't just there to say, hey, look at what a good life he had. They're meant to be read both literally and allegorically. So it shows him enjoying the afterlife, but again, it's a reminder of how he got there, right? That he had to earn this position. All right, next we're going to have a little bit of an aside, and this is what's called the Akhenaten or the Ammaran period. And so what happens is this was a revolution in Egyptian religion and society. It was not very long-lived, but what happened in the mid-14th century BCE, Imhotep IV, later known as Akhenaten, his reign was 1353 to 1355 BCE. Basically, under him, he abandoned the worship of almost all the gods in favor for a single god named Aten. He declared Aten to be the universal and only God, and he claimed he was both the son and the sole prophet of Aten. And he said the god revealed himself only to Akhenaten. And so what's also interesting is Aten, the god, was only represented as a sun disk, literally a round disk emitting life-giving rays. Now again, this was kind of short-lived. We're going to see for the most part the worship of the plural gods then continued and came back. But what was also interesting in this time period is the art itself changes a little bit more too. And it becomes less of that rigid and formal to more natural and curving. And we see this in the bust of Nefertiti. And it is believed this is unfinished. But again, you can see in this, Nefertiti was actually Akhenaten's queen. And you see here, right, much softer features than we've seen in other works. The curving lines, and then look at her neck, right? We have this elongated neck, which, is supposed to make her look more graceful. And so we see that in the artwork. But again, this was kind of more of an aside. Most of the art and the religion is going to go back to the way it was before. All right, and then we're going to finish up with probably the most common, or not common, the most well-known figure. And this is Tutankhamen. And this is the post-Ammaran period. And so what's interesting is the most famous of the post-Ammaran period, the most famous pharaoh is Tutankhamen. He ruled from 1333 to 1323 BCE. He ruled for a decade, and he died when he was 18 years old. However, his rule is largely unremarkable, but he is the image and the name most of us tend to know and associate with ancient Egypt. Greece is next week. Now, the reason for this is because in 1922, Howard Carter, who was a British archaeologist, he actually found Tutankhamun's tomb. And the tomb was largely intact. Other tombs had been, lost to battles or thieves had raided them, but Tutankhamun's tomb was mostly intact. And so that's actually why this pharaoh became so famous. This included the enshrined body of the pharaoh. It was inside 3 different coffins. And what you see here on the right, this is actually the innermost coffin. It was made of beaten gold, almost a 1/4 ton of gold, and then it was inlaid with semi-precious stones. And then on the left, very famously, is the death mask, also from the innermost coffin. So the death mask would be placed over the face of the pharaoh. And so again, we see this return, to the coffins, to the tombs, and to the idea, of mummification, of keeping that body so there is a place for the Ka to live in the afterlife. But it's interesting that, this is probably the most famous image. However, the pharaoh himself the rule was, except for his age, was pretty unremarkable. All right, then after this, we move into what's called the first millennium BCE. And what happens is we're seeing the decline of Egypt. Egypt lost its role as a commanding power at this time. Foreign powers continued to invade and occupy the land, and eventually the Egyptian empire dwindled away. The kingdom of Kush, Egypt's neighbor to the south, ruled over Egypt until about the 8th century BCE. The Nubians conquered Egypt and established themselves as the 25th dynasty. And then they fell to the Assyrians when they sacked Thebes in 660 BCE. And then finally in the 4th century BCE, we have Alexander the Great takes over, and eventually the emperors of Rome are going to replace the pharaohs as the rulers. But what's interesting to remember is we have to think of how long this Egyptian style lasted. And because of it, when we say Egyptian art, very clear ideas probably come into our heads. And so this longevity of the formal tradition in Egypt is actually one of the marvels of art history. It attests to the invention of artistic vocabulary so satisfactory that it endured in Egypt for millennia, meaning the people there liked it. They still saw it as a representation of them, right? Because what do we create art about? We create art about what reflects us, right? What we value. And so by having this almost, formulaic idea, it represented Egypt for so long. And as your textbook says, right, this shows that enduring tradition. And it ensured, it endured for millennia. And so we have to think about that and its longevity, because everywhere else in the ancient Mediterranean world, we had constant stylistic changes. And so the only thing common for most of the rest of the ancient Mediterranean world was that things always changed. Whereas in Egypt, we have this style that stayed for so long and was a clear representation of the Egyptian society.